folks can hear me. Um, I will
Oh, good.
presume. Yeah. Okay. Good. We're good. Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is David Johnson. I am uh, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health, and I direct our regional offices within the Office of the Secretary's Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. Sorry, really long introduction there. So I'm with HHS, Department of Health and Human Services. My background is I've been in this position for about 5 years, and the role of this in this position is we're one of the few offices in the federal government, especially in HHS, that actually have the ability of being out in the regions. Most of our organization is headquarters based, even though we do have a lot of folks that are actually not always in the headquarters side. But what we do here is we both really talk about how things work, but what we want to hear is how that resonates also with the regions themselves, with you and others on the ground outside of DC. And so part of that is both presenting information like this over to you as well, and also taking about feedback. How can we do things better as well? So it's one of those nice things. I've been with the government for over 20 years. The majority of that time was with a program office that actually did uh, grants, provided grants. So I've done all the things with grants. I've been a project officer. I've written those lovely notices of funding awards that you all probably struggle with, as we all do. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Assessed budgets, all of that. So today, first I should have started off with this. Thanks to Representative Bera, as well as Josh and the rest of the staff, for being able to put this together. As you all are aware, this is going to be a little bit more of the 201 version, presuming that most folks actually have a decent understanding of how to use grants.gov and how to search grants.gov as well. What we will talk about today is different strategies for preparing your application and also writing it. As I said before, my background is Department of Health and Human Services. So some of the examples I will go to that side because that's what I'm familiar with, but it's not limited just to that. I will also talk about the different types of applications, the different types of individuals that you all may be, but also, again, some common strategies of how to improve both your searches so that when you're applying for something, you're actually applying for something that you really want versus actually that you might have fallen into or like this seems good enough. So that's kind of what we want to talk about today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I guess a couple things for today. One is, and there we go. Let's share this first, and then so one of the things that I want to talk about and at least be a little bit more clear is as you all are in person, I am virtual. So please, if you do have questions, stop me. I could drone on for about an hour, and I would rather at least have some questions that come up. And I know Josh and his team will help support that. I may not always be able to see it, but if there's things that I'm going too fast for, if you do have questions, please do that. Let's try to make this as interactive as possible. And so that would be my preference. So with that, let's go ahead and just we'll start. So here is sorry. So here's part of the discussion areas that I want to talk about. Really is we're talking about preparing our applications. I want to address some considerations at a really high level of what you may have already thought about and maybe what you haven't quite thought about. And this goes into really where is that need? Why are you actually that special? But focus more about your own capacity. So we'll be talking about how you are showing and providing description rather than telling someone that. Thinking about data and ultimately focusing on your past results in order to help guide and influence those that are reviewing your application so that they see that experience there. And we'll go through drafting some of the responsibilities for an actual awardee. One of the things in here that you may notice or you may not have noticed is that I didn't put in here actually writing the application. I would probably make this akin to painting. For those that like painting and those that don't like painting, I'm one of those, but it's all about the prep. Once you've done the prep for painting, just like once you've done the prep for preparing your application, the writing will be done before you know it. And what takes a lot of time is really that effective prep. So with that, like I said, today, so we have a lot of different types of folks here. As you read through this, where I want to focus, and often what I focus on is that even if you're an NGO, even if you're not a small business, even if you're part of a municipality or other public works, I will consider you all. And I think one of the traits that I try to present through this is you all are our type of business, and you have to think about that in business. I come from the public health. I have a couple years outside in the private sector on the banking side prior to my career here. But one of the things that we do lack in public health and actually in general government is we don't always think about the business aspect of this. And so I want to certainly highlight that and talk about how that is not always the foolproof, but it is a really good approach to be able to do things because business is about direct effects. You're talking about increasing your revenues. You're talking about even if you're in nonprofit, you're really still talking about delivering product and showing value. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about here today. And I know that there's different folks from different types of functions, administrative side, budgetary side, program evaluations, and whatever it may be. So again, try to do a catch-all for everyone. But I really do want you to understand that this is for a very broad and in general group. But again, we can ask questions. I would again encourage you to do that. So qualifications is something that is typically not always addressed. So we'll look into that a tiny bit. Also about different ways to do some research and background. As I talked about presenting and doing all the planning. The planning and the presentation of all of that makes your writing go a lot easier. And then finally, the areas that I do like, and that will get much more into the details, and I think is hopefully generate a lot more conversation, is looking at your business acumen. How much of a business organization are you? What are areas that you can improve, and what areas are you can you exploit and really show your background on? Being very objective in when you're writing this. One of the areas that we'll talk about is having someone else take a look at what you wrote. You all have great programs, I'm sure. You all believe you have great programs, I'm sure. But there are individuals out there that will have a better program than you. How objective can you be when you are describing the need and what you can actually do? Having some level of professional arrogance. You want to be able to present that with authority, but also understand this is the approach that I'm using for the proposal that I am trying to get across to you. And then purposefulness. And when I use purposefulness, I'm really talking about looking at that long-term objective. What is it that you want to be able to do? It's not uncommon for someone when they're applying for grants or they want grants, they're looking for money. Yes, you are. But the purposefulness, what do you want that money to do? So 51% of the desire should be about really achieving that outcome rather than focusing on the dollars, because you might end up just chasing dollars going in. There's different types of grant systems in the federal government. All of you should be familiar with grants.gov. If you're not, right after this, please go to that. That is the place where all grants are published. There's a couple other systems where they're also published as well, but grants.gov is a repository for all federal grants. It is also a location upon which you will be submitting your application as well. There's also programmatic and departmental websites. So that's HHS.gov or SBA's small business or EPA, et cetera. So those are the other web pages that are really helpful to look for, because again, in your research, you want to know what the priorities are and the directives are of that agency, who is going to be making these funding proposals, who's going to be funding these proposals, excuse me. And then also SAM.gov. SAM.gov is System for Award Management. That's another one. If you don't know about SAM, you should go to that before you go to grants.gov after today. SAM.gov is a link, and you will get access to all of these slides as well. So the slides will be presented to you and provided to you after. SAM.gov is a requirement. If you are to apply and or to receive funds, you need to be registered in SAM.gov. And there'll be some resources in the back of this slide deck for that. But those highlighted are really the three that are very, very important. The other areas are things that you can, USA Spending and tags, the Tracking Accountability and Government Grant Systems, which is an HHS owned system. Those are helpful in doing some research, but I would focus on the first three to be as specific as possible. Grants policies. Again, before we get into the writing piece of this, have to establish a little bit of the foundation. And the foundation of this starts with 2 CFR 200. And this 2 it's the Code of Federal Regulations. And this is a specific regulation. It's a very long regulation that establishes these uniform administrative requirements for the entire government. So it doesn't matter where you get a grant or a cooperative agreement or financial assistance, it goes back to 2 CFR 200. And just to kind of give you, for those that aren't as familiar, this would be this overarching regulation. And then they start cascading down. So for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, we also have a sister regulation that is related to 2 CFR 200, and that's 45 CFR 75. We won't get into that. And then below that, there's the programs themselves also have regulations that support and indicate any of the requirements for that funded program. The reason why I provide this to you is these are resources that will help you when you are, again, developing your application. Knowing what is required of the program, of the grants, may not always be explicit in the notice of funding opportunities, the NOFO. And so these sources, again, when you're doing this background research, especially going back to the priorities of the program, this will give you a lot more background on this. And I think it will give you a little bit more of an advantage than just reading the NOFO itself. Again, it gives you a broader aspect, a better understanding of what the program itself is trying to achieve. And again, the purpose of these regulations really define the requirements, and it needs to be public. As we go through and we think about the grants life cycle, there's really, at least in HHS, think about it in 3 different ways: the pre-award, the award, and post-award. The award is really, when we talk about that as this designation, that is talking about when everything around receiving, quote unquote, the monies. So this pre-award process is the notice of funding applications and where we are talking about today, writing strategies and guidance. Then we get into this award phase. So that's after you've submitted all of this. And that's where there's some negotiation there. And then the final piece of this is really this quote unquote post-award. That's the hard part of it. That is implementing. So I may refer to pre-award, award, and post-award, but I wanted to give you this as a potential understanding of what the life cycle looks like, what this timeline and approach could be. As I said, the first part of my presentation is a little bit dry, and I apologize for that. But I want to, again, establish some foundations here about general understanding. So today we're going to talk about grants and cooperative agreements. There's multiple types of federal financial assistance, but today we're really talking about these two. And just to, again, I don't really like reading off of slides, but for the best understanding is a grant is really, Congress has allowed us, the federal government, the executive branch, to provide some type of financial assistance. And so that's between the awarding agency, us, and the non-federal entity, which is you, to be able to carry out this public purpose. So carrying out something of your idea that is authorized by Congress. And the caveat here, it is not to acquire property or services for the federal government. It is really all about ensuring that the public receives a direct benefit. Right? These are your tax dollars. These are my tax dollars. So this is us getting, allowing these monies to go back essentially into the community, into the state, to be able to further what you have identified as being needed there. The cooperative agreement is very similar to a grant. However, there is a specific caveat, and that caveat will be explained in the notice of funding opportunity, but it highlights a certain and specific level of substantial involvement from the federal awarding agency. So if I'm making this award and I'm having a cooperative agreement, what I'm saying is that we have much more say into the direction of it. In a grant, you propose it to us. We may say it needs to do this or this in the pre-award process in that negotiation, but for the most part, it's there. In a cooperative agreement, not too dissimilar, but a good example would be a training grant. If you were to train, say, clinical providers on a certain in a certain area, there may be new regulations that come out, and our job would be to say, you should be training, you need to adjust your training so that it meets this new these new requirements or something new like that. So that's just a brief example of that. I'm going to do what I usually don't like to do, and this is to explain something that this presentation is not about, and that is a contract. But I want to be really clear about this because sometimes we don't always understand, or it gets boggled a little bit between a grants and a contract. So a contract, or in our speak, is really an acquisition. Again, this is an instrument in which you as the recipient are actually acting on behalf of the federal government to purchase a service, provide a service, or purchase property, as it's said in here. So again, it's a contract. I think most people have a pretty good idea of what contracts mean, but there is a difference between grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts. So I just wanted to be clear on that. And then finally, as we think about where grants come from, and again, I use this as a potential a better understanding of when you're preparing for your grant, knowing these kind of steps is there's a law, and that's that authorizing statute, and an appropriations. And so the appropriations is that funding bill that comes from Congress. These are the things that actually tell what is authorized and what can do and why they are needed to a degree. Then in between that, there's an assistance listing. And so this is another part of I would argue, the bureaucracy that intends to describe why it can be done. What is the authorization around giving it to a certain program? And then finally, a program. So Congress authorizes it. It comes down through these series, and eventually it has to go to a program. The program is the organization, or the level of organization upon which is making that funding decision and that funding opportunity. And those programs are important because when Congress gives the funds, essentially gives the funds down and appropriates them, it goes to a program, and those programs represent certain priorities and have expertise. So again, often knowing where they authorize, what the authorizing statute is, and it doesn't have to be just the one for this funding opportunity, but some of these others. Again, it helps bring some breadth to your understanding about why the dollars are where they are, maybe historically where they came from. So again, when you're crafting your story, that you can put it into this context of this is why this initiative is important. I'm showing you why I understand really in-depthly why it's important and to what degree it is. So as we go through, one of the most important things is to look to assess and look at your own eligibility and qualifications. And so eligibility clearly is who can apply, and most grants allow all of these down here. The two asterisks that you'll see here is for-profit organizations and individuals. Those are things that I would highlight that of this group here, those are the ones that may or may not always be eligible for funding. Sometimes for-profit organizations are not eligible, and sometimes individuals themselves cannot apply, just as, again, David Johnson may not be able to apply for all of these. But for the most part, a very important piece is to look at when you're assessing a NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, is to look at the grant eligibility. The second piece of this, which is equally as important, is the qualifications. And so when I talk about qualifications, it is about who can apply, but in a different way. Are you qualified to apply? And these are elements that add specific requirements to an award. Do you need a certain certification? Let's just say someone is applying for training as an EMS provider. Does it require you to have an active CPR license? I don't know. Is it training for a medical provider? Again, I said this is going to be somewhat health focused, unfortunately, on some of these. But does it require you to have a certain degree if you're doing an RN or an MD or something else? Say it's financial and you're providing training as well. Do you need to have a CPA? Does someone have to have it? So these are the qualifications that you should really look into, because you might be eligible on one side, but not have the qualifications to be able to be eligible for that award. And also thinking about, when you look at this, there often, if not always, trickle down requirements. So if you are applying as the prime recipient, so right, you are the head, you're doing this, but you may have sub-recipients. We think about them as your partners. What you are required to have as a prime, your sub-recipients may also. So that's, again, something to be aware of when you're looking at these is, do my partners follow along this? One thing that is almost always required is if it is required that an awardee is a nonprofit, it is highly likely that all of your partners need to be nonprofits as well. I can't say that always about the qualifications, that if you as the prime who is doing the training has to have an MD or has to have a certain certification, that all of your others, but I would check this as well. And then to make it a little bit more complicated, what about these unwritten qualifications when we really think about it? Like, what makes you the best applicant? When you look at yourselves, when you are talking about yourselves, you really have to do a deep dive and be as objective as possible. How qualified do you think you are for this? And really step back and maybe even ask someone else. You might have a great idea, but do you have the qualifications? Do you have the acumen? Do you really have this background to be able to do this? And it's okay if it's low or medium, because then you might be able to have a partner. And there's always growth. You can always do more to be able to get there. Sometimes you are highly qualified, which is good. And there could be a chance upon which you might be even too highly qualified. I think several of us know that either been in a position where you want to apply for a job or you're interviewing people that are just too highly qualified. It doesn't seem like it may not be a good fit. So these are things to really think about is, do you really need this opportunity or do you want it? So those are, again, some of those things. Most importantly is showing versus telling. And I alluded to this in the intro. When you are writing and thinking about, especially your proposals and your applications, do your best to demonstrate the qualifications and your capability versus telling someone. Don't tell someone that you're 5'10". Describe why you have the ability to reach things or why that's important, right? You don't have to tell everyone that you have done that you have had 15 businesses. Describe that acumen, how you actually use those businesses as it relates to the proposal that you're writing into the job, or excuse me, the notice of funding opportunity. And again, don't always just to limit what is in that NOFO. The NOFO is only a certain number of pages. It will give you the brief stuff. It will give you what is certainly necessary, but there may be some things that that again, if you go back to the programmatic website or the programmatic priorities or the departmental priorities, when you go back to them, they may actually have some better, well-rounded language and provide more priorities for you to be able to address. So that's where I would also think about definitely taking the NOFO, but do some research beyond it. I added this in here, and we're not going to spend too much time on grants.gov, but the reason why I included this is that you're navigating the grant posting. There's certain places that you really clearly want to be able to see, and that's the description, that's in the synopsis. Again, these will be with you, but those, again, I just wanted to include this for general understanding. One of the most important parts of the grant posting is the due date and the due time. So if it is due on January 1st, 2025, that's very good, but also look at when it's due. If it's 5 o'clock Eastern time or 6 o'clock Eastern time, which is not uncommon for it to be there, you have to get it done by that time. If you are a second late, it most likely will not get reviewed. So take that into consideration. The other piece in this is, as you're doing that background research, looking at those related documents, and if you have questions on the grant application or on the process, there is always going to be a grant contact information, and please reach out to them. That is what their job is. And then finally, as we think about navigating these grant postings, what's important is to know that you are reading the most up-to-date NOFO, whatever that language is. It's not often that they do change, but there could be. And again, I'll have some other slides in here that will help identify the importance of that. So as you're thinking about both preparing your application and as well as, let me say that, as well as searching for it, there's different keywords versus contextual phrases. And, you know, some of the keywords that have been, and apologies that some of this is not as relevant, I think, to some of the executive orders that are currently happening, but they still be maybe in the lexicon out in the States. And so that's why I made sure to include this as keywords like disparities, inequity, inequality. And in that, and I won't go from all of left to all of right, but the idea is there are some keywords that the federal government has used in the past, or that may be used in the future, or that you may be using. And then there's these contextual phrases of what that means. And I think the reason why I use this is there's a soft balance between when to use the left side, when to really use the right side. Some of this may be helpful when you're searching for a grant, but I would argue that in your application, in your proposals, you should really consider using contextual phrases a little bit more than just just your keywords. You can use those keywords to show that you understand what they mean. But again, in my case, and what my strategy and my recommendation to you is, when you're using contextual phrases like this, you're showing, not just telling. So an example of a term that has been used in the past, and I think it's also, again, still used outside of within the States, is environmental justice. And in here, the contextual phrase is really talking about these unequal impacts of X, Y, and Z on the locality. It's not, environmental justice may have itself, it may be a loaded term, and it may not always mean the same thing to everyone. So again, making sure that you're being very clear about how you want to address these rather than just using a term. So again, another thing when you're searching for, and you're doing some of this research in order to prepare your application, maybe is looking at what other funded projects have occurred in the past. USAspending.gov is a public website, and the goal of USA Spending, that was part of a 2015 law that was passed, that it is for transparency. You should be able to find the funding amount, the expenditure, and the awardee for every new, going forward, and it goes back several years as well, every applicant that has ever received funding. And the reason why that's important is if you know a previous awardee or an application, and sometimes when you're looking at applications, there's a series, right? They occur in multiple years, is to go back and you can FOIA, that's the Freedom of Information Act, you can request a funded application. So if you're looking for, building bridges in rural America, let's just say that was a grant, and it was done by ABC Construction, you could find out when that last notice of award was. You find out what that award is, and you can request a copy of that awarded application. The reason why I bring that up is it may be helpful to understand what was so successful, why did they get it? These are publicly available information and data. So again, another resource. And so the final resource that I want to address to you all, and this is the Small Business Administration. As I stated before in the very beginning, I think of all of us and all of you, whether or not you're municipal or me, public, and some of you from the public sector, as being small businesses. The Small Business Administration is a huge resource if you're not already familiar with it. And it has a lot of resources that are helpful. I've also included for you all, this is likely the closest, you all being in Sacramento. I know Sacramento is a large area, but this is a contact, and like I said, it's in the slide deck that you'll receive. So I would recommend reaching out or at least looking at their websites, especially for the American Small Business Development Centers. What this is, they're helpful. They're there to help provide support for you as a small business. And like I said, whether or not you're an NGO, municipality might look a little differently, but for those that certainly are non-public, I would recommend going there. There's a lot of support, and they can help you think about different areas, especially if you might need different funding support, or if you might need a fiscal advisor and other fiscal backing. They may be able to help provide you those resources. And this is just a snapshot of their website with a bunch of different resources that they have. All right, so you've heard enough of kind of this background. Let's really get into the details on this in preparing your application. And right, that's what we're here for, is what are some of the strategies that we can think about? How do we make it stronger? How do we make it better? How do we really make it stand out? So for me, not to be pejorative, but make sure you read it. There's a lot of things in an application. There are page numbers, there's due dates. These are all small things that have a really big impact. And the impact is, if you don't adhere to them, your application may not be read. The perfect application that goes over a couple pages, even one page, may not be read. So that's what's really important. And also look at it before you start writing. What exactly are they asking for? Sometimes a title and a description may not be exactly what the funder is providing. So take your time to take this to look at it after you get the different NOFOs that you're interested in. Again, start very early. It's for someone who has written many notices of funding opportunities and has worked in many years of guiding applicants, successful applicants and not always successful applicants. It always takes longer than you think. Even for the most skilled, maybe after you've been doing it for 20 years, but you're probably not on this call if you've been successful for the past 20 years in preparing applications. It will take longer than you think. And that could be that the application takes longer, or life just happens. And you would plan to spend 4 hours tomorrow and something happens. It could be weather, it just could be anything. So just make sure, start as early as possible. I talked about SAM registration. This is critical. Again, first website to go on after this presentation, if you're not already registered, is sam.gov. You need to have an active registration when you submit your application, which can take several weeks. I would prepare no less than 3 weeks to have your SAM registration. They say that it can be done in 2. It also can take up to six weeks or longer. And sometimes it is taken even longer than that. Also consider, do you need an MOU or an MOA, these memorandums of understanding or agreement, or some other type of partnership documentation? If you do need those might take longer as well. The other types of documentations are letters of support, and then also letters of commitment. Both of these are helpful. I will tell you from my experience, a letter of commitment, as I would describe it, that is saying that I am like that partner ABC Corporation and mine, we are going to be, they're committed to work with me if this grant is awarded. Versus a letter of support, which is saying, we believe in your organization, they have done well, and they're a great community provider. I'm not suggesting a letter of support isn't helpful. I would argue that if it's between a letter of support and a letter of commitment, the letter of commitment, in my opinion, shows something. It shows that committed. It's demonstrating that, rather than someone just saying, you are good, you are this, you are high. That, to me, again, that is my recommendation. If it's between the two, I feel that the letter of commitment has more teeth and is a little bit thicker. The other piece of this slide is that box. You need to have realistic expectations. If this is your first application and it's a 500-page NOFO, you've never done one before, and it's a $214 million grant, you may want to partner with someone. Have these realistic expectations, especially if that's what if you're going for the first time. It's like your first job. It's a whole lot easier to get a grant after you have already received one or been part of one, just like your first job. First job's the hardest one. The ones after that are a little bit easier because you have that experience. So when you're drafting and developing your thoughts, things to think about this. Again, it's competitive. I know everyone's saying, duh, we know, but it is competitive. Look to your left, look to your right. Let's just presume you're competing against them. You're competing against your neighbors. You're competing against others. So it is competitive. You need to make sure that yours is stronger. It is more definitive. It is clearer than someone else's. So again, it gets back to planning. You have to be really clear about how you plan out your process. And ultimately, what is your goal? Is it to sustain program operations that you currently have right now? Is it to start program operations that you've been thinking about? Is it to add to those? All of these things that are listed there. And it could be more than those, but that's also something to consider. What do you really want to get out of these grant dollars? For anyone who is in that room, I'm going to say something, and hopefully you'll shake your head yes. Free money is very expensive. It sounds like it is a great idea, and it's a lot of work to be able to get grant funding. But once you get grant funding, there's a lot of additional costs, quote unquote, time, effort for those free funds. That's reporting. That's a lot of things. So again, part of your ultimate goal has to take into consideration the administrative functions that the government requires when it's giving out taxpayer dollars. Some other considerations that you want to make is, do you have a mentor that might be able to support you? Do you have a mentee that can learn from you as you're going through this? Are there other awardees? And again, I talked about partners and subrecipients. Is there someone that actually has a grant right now that you're interested in either getting that funding? Can you help support them? And that's kind of learning as an apprentice, something like that. And then finally, is if you are very new or you've been successful, but you want to continue to improve, is consider being a grant reviewer. That again, that now puts you on the other side. When you see all these applications come through, what really resonates and what doesn't? That is, and again, there'll be guidance at the end of this slide with some resources on how to become a reviewer for these. I think that's also, again, a very helpful avenue to go about. And for anyone in the room who has actually been a reviewer, I think you would probably also agree that there is significant benefit from that experience. So again, now as we start shaping this application and getting into different ways, this is a business acronym that a colleague of mine provided to me years ago, and I've used it in business. I use it in my work today. I also think that there's parts of this that are very important to understand or to use when you're developing your application. And it's PAVE. It's performance, accountability, value. And this is a little bit of a class in its own, but why I use this is there's to show performance, right? There are tasks that we do, but it's really about how did we perform those tasks. And so as you shape your application, what have you done in the past that you can go to show capability, to show acumen, to show this background? And that's your performance. You want to be able to show the reviewer, the reader of your applications, that you have the ability to perform and that you have experience in performing. Even if you haven't done, this is your first application or your first foray into this specific topic, you can still show performance. And that's important. Accountability, how do you hold yourself to that? And that leads into that performance. But how do you show that you're accountable? And this is a couple different ways. This is at different business levels as well. You always want to be accountable as a reporter. And when I say reporter, when you're reporting your efforts and your progress to the funder. But accountability is important because it shows the controls that you have. How do you do your business? Again, describing that, showing that you have the acumen of being a business operator. Again, the government is providing you dollars. They want those dollars to be used as best as possible. You need to be accountable. And by showing that you have these controls in place to be able to do this, this is how we manage this process. This is how we manage our hiring process. This is how we manage our execution process. This is how we manage our evaluation. Those are all very important. So thinking about that. Value, and I'm going to get to this next slide to really talk about value. But this is the most important piece of all of this. How can you, as the applicant, show the value beyond what you think someone is expecting? Value is the only thing that you really can show and create without always having to demonstrate. The value, we want to be able to provide a $100,000 grant to someone who shows more value than the neighbor of that one. There could be two applications that are very, very similar, but one has demonstrated value. And when I think about value, I'm really talking about what is your intervention, who are you serving, but most importantly, the strategy. And like I said, we'll get into that on the next slide because I think there's some pieces to that I do believe will help strengthen your application. And then empathy. And this is really business empathy. And in this, it is addressing, how you do the work, but why is it that your approach takes into consideration how the community, how other individuals really feel about their different circumstances. In some cases, it's being objective, in my opinion, as you're writing this. This business empathy needs to be put in your application of showing, I understand the needs of whoever it is and whomever they are that we are going to provide these services for them. So again, that's, for me, these are the things that I think are a good way of defining how you approach this. So again, your application is your story. That's all it is. And you need to tell it in a way that resonates with someone who you have no idea is on the other, who's listening, which makes it really challenging. Part of my recommendation is be objective as possible. When you come across of saying, I have the best idea ever that no one else has thought about. Do you actually know that? Show the story. Don't always have to explain why this is. So in there, make sure it's clear. The narrative is the most important part of this process. You have to do your budget, I know. You have to do some of this other stuff, but the narrative is your story. You are the ones who are laying it out. So be clear about this. If you're all competing in the same community, you're going to have the same relative backgrounds. So your data, your history, why the need exists isn't going to be that uncommon. But what are you providing? What are you delivering that makes you better than the person sitting next to you? And that gets into what value are you providing? This value looks at this proposal. So this is your intervention. You're choosing to use intervention A. There may be someone else that's using that or has an idea very similar. The environment upon which you are implementing that intervention may not be that different from someone else, even if it's in a different state, different county, different locale. The part of value that really is the takeaway that only makes the part of that proposal and the part of that environmental study, that scan, again, whatever that milieu that you're going to be implementing in is how you are going to do that. And this is your technical expertise. This is your demonstrated ability to be able to do the work. This is what you need to be focusing on, even more than the intervention itself and the environment. And the environment really is why it's needed. Because again, the person reading it is going to understand, relatively speaking, that the environment that you are responding to needs the service. It needs your expertise. The question is, are you the right person to provide that? Are you the right person to receive these funds to execute that? And that's going back one bullet, is that's where you have to be objective. You all should believe that everything that you are writing is the best, but does it read that way? Going back to like grade school and high school, the best papers you probably wrote were the ones that you didn't do overnight. Now, there might have been some great essays that you did do overnight or that day, but when you put something down and then you pick it up a day or a week, even a week later, it does read a lot differently. It also is helpful when you give someone else who may know what you're doing, or even someone that doesn't know what your approach is. When you give it to them, they will find mistakes. Often they will find gaps where when we do something every day, we may miss something that we just do every day that's really critical. And we say, well, how is that possible? We've all done it. Let's be honest. If we're honest with ourselves, we probably have written something before that we do every single day and we forgot one step, and that might be a critical step. So again, giving someone else that, being objective, really setting those expectations there. And again, this really last bullet here is ultimately a core piece of this. It really needs to, whatever you're applying for, I believe, again, the likelihood of success should align with the mission. So if you are applying for something that really truly aligns with your mission versus something that it would be a good idea to apply for, your heart may not always be in it as much. It will be much more in it. And I think the quality of your applications will go much further when the application is aligned with the mission. The application and funding is aligned with the mission and the priorities of your organization, of your division, whatever it is that's supporting this. Again, so right, as we're getting through this and we're really trying to figure out, all right, so we have a proposal here. We have an idea of what we want to do. Who are we talking to? Who is the audience? Right? We want our story to resonate. And you may not always know who that is. But I would say the one thing that you should expect when someone is reviewing your application is that they have some level of technical expertise on the subject matter upon which you are asking for money. So they will have a technical understanding. That doesn't mean you skip the elementary stuff. It also doesn't mean that you have to teach them everything else either. But understand that there should be, the audience will understand the general background of the topic that you're trying to do. Content, you really want to have, again, strength. Show and demonstrate what you have done as your corporate capabilities, rather than just tell them that I have done this. Really show that impact. That's what you want to be able to convey over. Use appropriate language. When I say that is, you don't always have to use you know, language that is at such a high level and expertise to show competency. I think it's helpful every now and then, depending on what area you're focusing on. At the same time, it does help when you show your competence by using your own language that describes it. So if we go back to a couple slides where we had those keywords in the contextual phrases, that's where I'm talking about. It's good to have a keyword here so people know that you have that, but being able to explain it on your own also shows a well-roundedness. And so in that, when we talk about well-roundedness, syntax, right? What is that concentration? When in syntax, I'm really thinking about the flow of your argument, how your proposal goes from a background to an understanding, drawing the background picture, the data that support and describe the level, right? That amount, but also that qualitative need, that quantitative, qualitative level of that, to use examples, right? All of you have to show some need of why you want this, why the money would be appropriate to go to you so that you can provide this intervention, whatever that intervention might be. So think about that flow. Where do you want to put a lot of effort in? I would argue that make sure that you're drawing a good background, why there is a need for this area, for the funding in a certain area. But don't focus so much on that you don't give enough space to talk about both your accomplishments, why you have acumen, why you can do this, as well as also describing how you are going to implement your intervention in the way that shows you in the best light. And so that's kind of this flow. That's part of the order. Also consider about how you want to end it. Applications likely will always have a page limit that is not long enough for you to show and you to describe exactly what you want to describe. So think about that. You don't want to come back to the 50th page at the end and then just be end. Try to end it somewhere where, again, you're reading a story, you're presenting a story. It shows, I would argue, it shows professionalism, it shows competence, it shows the ability to plan, right? That you're not just using the last line of 50 pages to spit out your argument. You've actually understood this. This is why we can do this. We've shown X and Y. You're closing off with even just one paragraph to show your acumen. And again, it needs to be relevant. How do you make that connection to this unknown reader? Try to think about the relevance. And that's why I was talking about earlier, going back to the web pages, going back to the programs that have established, that are receiving those funds. That's what's important, is being relevant. Again, be objective. You have to think about that audience. We've talked about the subject matter experts. These are individuals that have read before, and they have received training on reading announcements. So it is looking at that announcement. What do they really need to hear? So make sure you're including that, and then adding more up and down. The fourth bullet here, that varied energy level. This is just being honest. Your application is going to be one of many that they're reading. That is something that I don't think many people really probably think about, is that you may be the first application that John and Jane Smith are reading. You may be the last one. You may be somewhere in the middle. You may be one that follows a really, really good application, and it could be one that follows a really, really bad application. So that's just something that, think about that. How can you make your application easy for the reader? And part of that is following that order. So that last slide, right? Order. If it says, if the NOFO, the Notice of Funding application, says follow this, I would recommend following it. There's nothing worse, being a reader myself, having done this, is trying to find something in your application. If it flows nicely, oh my gosh, those are really nicely to read. You know what they need, you know what they want, you know what they're proposing, and you have a pretty good idea of what they can accomplish. Make it easy for the reader. And then also, everyone that is reading really wants, we have investment, and I say this as a Fed, but usually the folks that are reading these are not Feds. It depends on the program. But everyone who reads this really does have a desire to make sure that when we are proposing or we are recommending an application for funding, we want that applicant to do good. So understand that there is this dedication of the reader to make sure, like, we want to make sure that this is the right one. There's only a limited amount of funds, and we want to make sure those funds go to the right group. And finally, they're just you and me, right? There are folks that there are individuals who might be public servants. They might be independent individuals that are reviewers. It could be anyone, but they are just you and me, and they do have a desire to make that difference. And like I said, so use your neighbors, use your colleagues, use other folks to help support you in how you want to write that. We haven't talked too much about, a lot of this has been about preparing in the narrative piece and the non-financials. But what I do want to say is what's really important is really thinking about, do you have the capability of spending this money? And in that, it is, how are you drafting these parts of the budget? The real cost, and those actual costs to carry out the program. And it could be, that includes both those award funds that you're asking for, any other matching funds. So you might be getting, this may be an initiative that is funded by 3 different grants. And then it also could be money that you have indirect dollars, or you have other dollars from your organization itself that you're going to be putting forward. So what really are these real costs? Additionally, if it is more than a one-year project period, you're going to have to think about, what are these future? What's the amortization of some of these costs? How do you go forward with these? So if funded, can you actually, again, can you afford to execute the program at your funded amount? Year 1 is usually not so bad because that's a lot easier. Year 2, and then year 3 and year 4 maybe, or even year 5. Is there enough funding in your proposal to last you through those years? And this is presuming that these are annual awards. So in year 1, you get $1 million. In year 2, you get $1 million. In year 3, you get $1 million, et cetera, or whatever it is. What can you do? Have you budgeted appropriately? Because inflation, everyone knows inflation, right? These out-year escalation costs are really critical. You live and die by them. If you don't account for them well, you won't be able to execute the program. And the funder will not be happy. And it may not look good. So those are things that I really want to point out. And this other piece about, what is that, right? Any budgeter who's done this before, and you learn, because often it happens where you have to put this in there. How much can you factor? There's a level of uncertainty that you're going to have to put in. And this is where the expertise of SBA, is Small Business Administration, maybe your accountants, whoever it is that might be able to help. This is where some of that expertise, if you don't have it yourself, this is where I would recommend to ask them, how do I account for things that I don't know? Is 2.1% escalation in the future a good one? Is 4.2 good? Is it too high? Is it too low? These are things that they will help you for. Because salaries is going to be one of those harder things to be able to do this. Are you adding these salary adjustments? And then also, most important, and this is something that has come up very early, and there's a hold on it, is, do you need indirect costs? So when you're applying for a grant of $100,000, for example, and you have a 15% requirement, or you have more that you need to be able to pay back, right? These are these shared costs across your organization. Let's just use 15%. It's the current de minimis within HHS. Can that 15%, can that $15,000, is that enough to help support? And that resulting $85,000, is that $85,000 enough for you to be able to administer and execute the program that you've applied for if you receive that $100,000? So again, some of these just high-level pieces of this. When you're thinking about, again, your backgrounds and all of this, and including what we just talked about in business, on the business side of it, is, what are the data telling us? When you're asking for an award for $1 million, is that enough? Is it too much? How much of it's too much? If it's not enough, how much is it not enough? That was really bad language right there. Is it too low? It has to really be appropriate. And that gets into understanding where those dollars are. Has there been past legislation, either at the national level or even at your state level, that can help support your application and your proposal? When we think about these current resources, what is happening in your area? If you're asking for a certain amount of money, and an award was just given to your community or your area or whatever your focus is, uh, do you really know? Do you really need this money? Is the need there? It could be yet absolutely yes. We got an influx of this amount of money in this area. Let's just say for nutrition or for I don't know, supporting the community to for taxes. I don't know, whatever it could be. Is this something that it still wasn't enough? So knowing what those data are, knowing what that information is, it's helpful because again, the reviewer might actually know that. Your reviewer might even be from your area and say, hey, I'm from there. There is just an influx of $50 million in this area. I'm not sure those data are really that accurate. So again, using those to help support what it is that you're trying to do. Are there other folks that actually have helped and have been in that area? And again, this doesn't have to do with health. It can be in agriculture. It could be in building. It could be whatever that your area is. Are there those potential partners? What collaborations have already occurred? What are being planned for? How do you use that as leverage to improve that? And again, I talked about it a little bit earlier as one of the websites, and that's usaspending.gov. It could be where is there an old proposal that has been awarded? Would you be doing the exact same thing? You may not know what has been done. So again, looking back at those sites to be able to do that. You know, after you finally, again, we haven't even started writing this yet, which I know that might be a little frustrated right now. Something to be considered is, right, teaching to the test a little bit. How is it evaluated? In every NOFO, there are very specific evaluation criteria. And these evaluation criteria are what these are what all of the applications will be scored upon and will be rated upon, or whatever rubric is being used by the organization. And so in this, how is it being evaluated? So we, HHS, will always have those specifics, and every organization will as well. You have to be able to meet those eligibility criteria. Are you also qualified? Look to see what that weighting of those review criteria could be. If your budget, I mean, you need a budget, but if if the budget is worth 5%, you probably don't want to spend and really put so much effort in this, especially if your evaluation is 25%. If the sophistication or the technology or whatever innovation that you're using is scored at 40%, that's where you want to also make sure that you're putting that effort in. Your effort should be consistent with the weighting of your review criteria. And again, so we talked a little bit about who's going to be reviewing. For HHS, I can speak to this. It's generally non-federal staff that are doing this, working through a contract or working through somebody else. Again, we want the folks from the public to be able to take a look at this. It is much more objective for someone to be able to do this, at least in our opinion. Federal staff may review some of these as well. It just always depends. But understand that there is a merit review committee that is going to look at it. They're objective. They're to be objective in order to do that. And then as far as an office director, that's usually a decision criteria level. But this is all very, very well spelled out in a NOFO. The takeaway to this is your application, your proposal, your story really should make sure that it does tie back to these evaluation criteria. Great. So we get this. It goes through. Now you've been awarded. That's the great news, right? Or we think it's the great news. So what is it going to take? What are your responsibilities? What do you really have to do? And this is where you thought all the hard work has already happened. You've done all this research. You've written it. You've waited these agonizing weeks, if not months, to find out the result. Now you have to the hard work really starts now. Now you have to execute it, which means you have to implement this award. You have to implement this business intervention. You have to report on this business intervention. You have to report not only in the financials, but on the progress, the technical progress of it. You have to submit multiple reports to your funder. Again, we're trying to reduce those because we want you to focus your time and effort on the implementation, not on reporting to us. But there does, in all honesty, from a transparency standpoint and from an accountability standpoint, we definitely need to know how well you're doing because we don't want to end up at the 5th year and say, where did all this money go? But read through, that's something that we'll get to. Like you read through these, the terms and conditions. When do you have to report? How do you have to report it? Allowable, applicable, and reasonable. These are the necessary costs, right? These are things that, can you spend the money on something? Well, is it allowable, right? There are things that you can spend money and you can't. How are you going to allocate it? Like, where is it coming from? Where is it going to be used for? What is it going to be going for? What is the proportion of your award that might be there? Is it reasonable? Right? That's more of that quality standpoint. Do you really need to spend 18% on, I don't know, a ream of paper, whatever it is? Is it actually reasonable? Is there a reason why you should be doing it? And reasonable and necessary kind of together. But 45 CFR 75 actually has different areas in that. And so you can get a better idea of what's there. Do you also need to get prior approval? Often, changing the principal, the head of the organization that's running this program, that is usually that person has signing authority. So you have to really be thoughtful. If you applied using Jane Smith, and now the new person is Mary Smith, no relation, they have to, you have to get this approval. So these are things that really you have to look into it. It's frankly, for anyone who's gone through any loan process, it's very much like that. They're giving you money, and these are the agreements that you are held to, whether or not you've read all of them or not. Once you take $1, you have now fully accepted that award. I'm not going the other piece of this is these last two bullets, most specifically that last bullet, is you are responsible for your subawardees, your subrecipients, if you happen to have them. The federal government typically only has a relationship with one person, and that is the group, that is the entity that is receiving the funds. When I say one person, I really mean the entity. If you have other subawardees, if they do good, you do good. If they do bad, you do bad. If they're doing something incorrectly, we are not focusing on them. We are focusing on you, because you have accepted the award. You are responsible for the award. So there is a big part of monitoring the subrecipients. And that's critical, because they could either make you do very well, or they could pull you down if they are not using it appropriately. So outside of this is probably not as interesting. So we'll skip who actually makes the award decision, but this will depend on each agency. But know that there is a process for that. And then finally, again, the reason why I wanted to include this is how you are notified, and more importantly, the notice of award elements. These are things, the reason why I think this is important is because when you're crafting, these are things to know what to expect. Your budget period, your project period, and this is usually the extent. Was it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Budget periods are usually in 12-month increments. They may change. Knowing this going forward, right, it will be very clear in the notice of funding opportunity what the potential project period would be, right? The length of the term of the contract, the grant, which often has annual increments. So you'll have to reapply every year. That's not uncommon. It's not always a necessity, but it's not uncommon. And then more importantly, it's like, who are your contacts as you go through standard terms and conditions that we already talked about. And then finally, as we kind of get to the end, is how many applicants, how do you know if you haven't gotten an award? Because that's something you want to know. It could be months before, but by the time you submit and then find out. There is a process, and usually it is identified in the notice of funding award. The NOFO, what that process is. But eventually, applicants who have not received an award will be notified. You can always follow up with that point of contact as well throughout that. So that's one of those areas where it is helpful. You need to know that. With that, I certainly, this is completely open for questions. This is the end of the formal presentation. Like I said, there's a couple different, as we get through, you will see this in the packet that eventually will be sent to you by Josh and his team. You'll see different resources for grants.gov right here, some additional grant resources. This is a slide that I've alluded to before. It's not just limited to HHS, but one of my recommendations, if you're brand new and you have time, and they also pay, by the way. being a grant reviewer does pay. Now, it may seem a lot, and usually it's a couple $100 a day, or depending on per application, it's just all. But some applications can be very long, so it does pay. But it may be, you have to understand, it could be a lot of reading as well. Talk about, here's some slides on how to register with grants.gov, which I think are very important. And then the final part of this deck actually has slides on SAM.gov. And SAM.gov is a system for award management. The most important piece of this talk today is making sure you register on SAM, and it does require an annual registration. You have to recertify every year. So the hard part is the first year. Once you recertify, I think if things don't change in your organization much, it's a little bit easier. The other piece that I will tell you is SAM.gov registration. SAM registration does not cost money. There are organizations that can help and that have helped individuals, and that could make it easier for you to register, but there is no requirement to use a paid service for SAM.gov. Again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use that. I'm just saying there is not a requirement to use one. Some could be very helpful, but I know I've gotten questions about, someone told me I had to use them. That's the only way to do it. That is incorrect. You can do this on your own. It does take a few days to get the requirements that in order to be able to upload, etc. But you can do this all on your own.